Hello coders, and welcome back to another video. In this video, we are going to be covering loops, specifically a for loop. So if you've never heard of a loop is a repeating mechanism that allows you to repeat a certain amount of code or certain lines of code. So for example, let's say you are constantly wanting to add a number to another number, maybe 50 more numbers. Then you wouldn't want to have to create 50 print statements to add to that number or 50 variables to add to that number. So in this case, you could use a loop that will allow you to add to that number 50 times without having to create extra variables or print statements to either change or view that calculation as it increases. So you may also want to show something like a certain message over and over again. And if that's the case, a for loop will also be helpful so you don't have to constantly keep typing out what that message is. So for it to make a little bit more sense, let's go ahead and get into the tutorial. So as I mentioned, the for loop is just used to run a block of code for a certain number of times, and you're going to tell the loop how many times it's going to run. So first, when you're creating a loop, you have to start off with for. And for should be lowercase. There should be no capital F. If you use a capital, it's going to give you an error. For is going to be followed by parentheses, and then that is followed by curly braces. Okay, so I'm going to put here end of for loop so we know. Now, as you see, we still get an error. That is because inside of the parentheses, there goes three major key points of the loop. So let's start with the first one. The first one is when you initialize or declare a variable that's going to be used within the for loop. So this variable is only for the for loop. So you would have to initialize it or create it right here. So in this case, generally this is going to be a number. So you could start off with int, and then you have to give the variable a name. And remember, with variables, it can be anything, but typically I is used. And I put I for iteration or initialization. So int I equals, and then whatever you're putting after the equal sign is going to be where you want that variable number to start. So what count is it going to start at? Is it going to start at 0? Is it going to start at 1? Is it going to start at 15? Is it going to start at 20, etc.? That's what you would have to determine. But for this example, we'll just start with 0. So now we created a variable that's going to start at 0. And we now need to use this variable to make the rest of our important header information in our for loop. And if you don't know what a header is the information that is after the for keyword. So everything going into the parentheses is basically forming the header. So now that we have our variable initialized or created, we have to use it. So the next portion is actually the condition that is going to be checked, and this condition is what basically tells the loop to keep running. So as long as this condition we place is true, your loop is going to run. As soon as that condition becomes false, that's when your loop stops running. So this is one of the main important key parts. Now, for you to utilize that variable, you would first have to start off with the variable. So for that example, it would be I, and then you would give it a condition. So typically we would give it a condition while I is less than or greater than a certain number, but generally the most common one that's used is less than. So if I is less than, and for this case, we'll put 10, and then that's a condition. So as soon as you finish your condition, you hit the semicolon. right? So now we have a condition. We have a variable initialized and we have a condition. So I is less than 10. So this loop is going to run for every time that I is still less than 10. Once I is greater than 10, your loop is going to stop running. The final thing you want to do is put the increment or decrement on the end of your header. So that is known as, some people call it the update expression. So it's just going to update that initial variable that we created, which was I. So it's just going to add 1 to I. So I is continuing to change. So you can put I plus plus. And that will then change I every time the loop runs. So that way I does not remain at 0 and we do not have an infinite loop. Now, I just mentioned an infinite loop. And an infinite loop is a loop that will run forever. So I'll show you that in a second, but we'll go ahead and get into this. So now that we have our for loop created, you see we have no errors, but our for loop is not going to do anything. So I'm going to simply put in a print statement. I'm going to put a print statement in, and then I'm going to put this is a for loop, and we'll use this. And then, of course, use your semicolon to close it out. All right, so our for loop, this is what we call the for loop body. Why is it the for loop body? Because it's basically everything that's going to run when the for loop executes. So anything you want to run in the for loop has to be within the for loop body. If it's outside of it, it basically is a standalone piece of code in your original main method or program. So in this case, we have, this is a for loop. So let's go ahead and just run this to see our outcome. And as you see here, it says this is a for loop. And it gives it to us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. So it printed it out for us 10 times. So in this case, if you see this, then it shows you how the loop works. It printed out as long as I was less than 10, that one statement we had. Now, could you have printed out something else? Yes. So for this, let's copy our print statement and put that here. Then we could say, as a string, I is currently, then we'll put I. Okay. Now this would give us a count of what I is as the loop runs. So here we have that. So now you can kind of get an idea of how the loop is working. Okay. So when we first click run, your loop creates that variable I and it starts at 0. So if you look in our loop body, we clearly say this is a for loop. So that's the first thing that's going to come out, which it did. And then the very next thing we said is to print what I currently is so that we can get a glimpse into what I is and watch it increase. And as you see here, it started off as 0, which is exactly what we started off at, 0. As you see, once the condition is checked, so this is created once, all right? NI is created once. NI does not get created every single time the loop runs. It just gets created that first time. The only thing that actually happens to change when the for loop runs is the condition. So if you look, once we say I++, it's going to increase this I. So what happens is it will check the condition first to see if the condition is still true. If the condition is true, it'll print out the for loop body, and then it will take the variable up and increment it by 1, and then it will come back to the condition and check to see if it's true. So it kind of goes condition, body, increment, condition, body, increment. That's how it works. So it kind of jumps between the header and the for loop execution. But as you see here, we go from 0 to 9, and then that's where it stops. Because after this for loop runs here, okay, remember we said it's going to increment here. And after this runs from 9, when it says I is currently 9, if it goes up, adds 1 to 9, that becomes 10. So that next time it checks if I is less than 10, it is not, because it would have been 10. So if you want to include 10, you would have to say if it is less than or equal to 10. And then that would allow you to see 10, as you see here. So sometimes you need to realize if you want to use the equal sign as well, because that means you would be including that number that you have at the end of the condition. So just keep that in mind. So for this, I'm going to take that line out and I'll use it in our next for loop. So that's our first for loop example. I'll go ahead and create another one. All right. So another example of a for loop. So another way you could do it is you could create a variable or a string outside, right? So you could do like string L, and I'm just putting something random, equals for loop. Okay, we have a string. Now we can use this string later on in our for loop. So let's go ahead and create the for loop, and we're going to say for int, and I use I above, so I'm going to use something else. So I'm going to do for int x equals, I'm going to start it off at 5. And remember, your variable can be anything you want it to be. I'm going to say while x is less than or equal to. Now, as you know, you could put another number on this other side of this equal sign. Or if you remember, with our string methods, there is a way that you can get a number back. So let's say we want to run this loop for every character in a string. The string we created was L. So let's create a loop that would run and maybe potentially print out each letter or the count of each letter in string L. So to do that, you would have to have a string created, and we do, and it's going to be L. And if you do dot, and we're going to do length, okay? Remember, when we do dot length, that returns the number of characters in a string. So therefore, when we're saying x is less than or equal to L dot length, it's really saying x is less than or equal to a certain number, not the string. Then we're going to put our increment, close off our for loop, and oh, I forgot, changed it to x, okay, x plus plus. All right, now we're ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and put our print statement, and inside of our print statement, I'm simply just going to put x so we can see what it is currently. So then when we go ahead and run our code, then you see it prints out 5, 6, and 7. Remember, we said to start x at 5. So if you start x at 5, then that's basically where it's going to start. Now, are there more characters than 5, 6, and 7? Yes. But because we told our variable to start at the 5th position, that's what it did. So there is a way that you could also get the actual character that is being accessed at that specific time in the loop when you're working with a string. In this case, As I mentioned, we are using the else string to help us run our for loop, and that length is being used in the condition. And for us to figure out where our character is, you can create a print statement. And what you want to do is use the char at, because if you say what is the char or the character at this position of the index, then it will return it to you. So to do that, it will be L dot char at X. And this is going to print the letter the loop is currently at. All right, and we'll go ahead and click run on that. So if you see here, it gives us O, and then it gives it P, and then it prints out 7, because 7, we put X is less than or equal to the length. And remember, the length is going to be off, because if you count from 0 in the for loop, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're getting an error because it's trying to access the character at the 7th position. We don't have a character at the 7th position, which is why it's giving us an error. It's not going to print that out. So you have to keep that in mind when you're working with this. So in this case, you probably would not want to use this equal sign there, because then it will cause you errors. Then if you run it again, you see we no longer have an error, because it's saying as long as X is less than the length, which is what we need, then it's going to print out the character for us. So it only prints out the 5th and the 6th character. Now remember, we could start at 0 to get all the characters. So if you change this from a 5 and make it a 0, and then you rerun it, it will print out all of the characters for you one at a time. And in this case, we don't really care to see that, what I is. So we'll run it again. And then now you see it prints out for loop, one character at a time. So that is another helpful thing you can use loops for, is to access the characters or print out the characters of a certain string. You could also display numbers, so like printing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or counting or displaying a certain number. You can also use a loop to change a number as well. So I'll show a quick example of that to wrap us up. So example 3. For this, I'm going to create an int called sum, and that's going to equal 0. Then I'm going to create my for loop. So for, I'm going to do int I again equals 0. Then I'm going to do while I is less than or equal to 1,000. Then I'm going to put I plus plus, okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually utilize sum in the for loop. So what I'm going to do is say sum is going to equal sum, okay, plus, I'm going to give it a number, or let's put 2. So that's going to change the sum, and I'm going to here print out sum is currently then add sum. So if I were to do this right now, all it's going to do is change the value of sum every time for the loop. So I'll click run so you can see what I mean. And basically it adds 2 to the loop, but it runs it for 1,000 times. And because we're skipping by 2, that's why you're seeing this number increase. Right? So another thing you could do is if you were to just do I++, then you'll see that it's just going to print that out. But you could have easily changed this to be 10. And then we'll get bigger number, right? It's still going to print it 1,000 times, but it's going to give you a bigger number. Or you could have done plus I to use it in here. And then that's adding a sum of all of the numbers that the loop is going through. So it's literally starting from 1 and then adding 1 to 2. Then it's adding, see here it says 3 and it's jumping. So you can see it jumping, right? So that's also something you could do. There's multiple ways you can use loops. You just kind of have to understand what it is you're trying to do, but it's very helpful when you're trying to make certain calculations. If you're trying to increase a number or keep count of how many times something happens or how many times something appears, such as the characters, that's where I have had most of the benefit from. Or really, you could use a for loop to, like I said, display certain information over and over again. So if you're making a interactive like program, I'm just going to show a quick example of what I mean by that. So if you were to say for int I is equal to 0, for this I is going to be less than or equal to, and I'm going to leave that blank for now, I++. Now what I'm going to show you is how you can involve the scanner. So I need to go import the scanner. So import java.util. And I'm going to use the asterisk. And when you use the asterisk, it imports everything from the Java util. So I don't necessarily have to specify exactly which class inside of that package I want to use. But I'm going to create a scanner object. Scanner scan equals new scanner system.in. Okay. Then I'm going to use scanner. I'm going to say a print statement first. And I'm going to say, please enter the number of times you would like to play my game. Okay. So now we're going to use that, and the next thing we're going to do is create a variable for it. So int num, it's going to equal scan dot next int. Oops. Scan dot next. There it is. Next int. And then this is going to hold the number of times to play game, and then we're going to use this in the for loop. So then I is going to be less than or equal to num. All right, and then that solves that. So then in here you can have a print statement that says, welcome to my game. And I'm not going to actually build out a whole game, but I'm just going to show you the concept for this. Please choose a game to play. And then we'll give them some options. So we could say, guess the number. Guess the number, or we could say 2 is let's say truth or dare generator. Okay. So then that will print out to the user which game they would like to play. And then in this scenario, right, we're using a for loop. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you what happens if we just use the for loop. But before I do that, I want to add some lines to help break up our output so it's easier for you to see. And we'll do that first. So I usually use these dashes just to help break up my output if I'm doing multiple things in one program. All right, click run on that. Then there you go. So it's asking us how many times we want to run the game. We'll say 3. And then there you see that it basically started from 0 and then it went its way up to 3. So it asked us once, twice, third time, fourth time. Remember, we started at 0. So if we wanted them to start at 1 for this, run it again, we'll say 3 again. Then you see it asked them exactly 3 times. So that's why I said it's very important when you're creating that initialization variable in your for loop that you understand how it's going to work in your favor. So in this case, we didn't want to start our int I at 0. We would rather start it at 1 because, you know, everyday humans count from 1 and not 0 like the program. But that just gives you an example of how it could constantly repeat this game for you. So that way, if the user wants to continue to play the game over and over again, then they can do such without you having to continuously write the code over and over again. So this for loop is going to hold the code. The other thing that you could have done in this case, right, is you could have asked them, okay, so, you know, enter the So we could say, please enter game number, right? Then we do that. Then we say int gnum is going to equal to scan dot next int again holds number game. So they would have to please enter the game number, and I'm gonna put 1 or 2 so it's more specific. Then what you could do is you could have had like an if statement here, right? So now we're tying our other things that we've learned in Java together. So you could have an if statement and you could say if, you know, if gnum is equal to 1, then we would to run this game. So in this would run guess the number. So I'm just going to put a print statement that says welcome to guess the number. All right, I'm not actually going to build the game, but I'm just showing you the concept of what can be done, right? So then you could do the else if gnum is equal to 2. Then we're going to say, and it was welcome to truth or dare. All right. Then to end this, we are going to do an else statement. And the else is going to make sure that they entered either 1 or 2. If they didn't, we're going to tell them that you entered a invalid option. Try again. All right. There we have that. So now we have a for loop and we have some sort of framework for a game. So I'm going ahead and run this, and it says, please enter the number of times you want to play the game. I'll say 3 again. Now it's asking me to enter the game that I want to play. I want to play number 1. And then here it tells me, welcome to guess the number. Now, the reason it immediately hopped back to that menu was because I didn't put any more into the welcome to the guess my number area. So this, in this if statement, is where I would actually run my game, but I never created it. So that's why I just prints out that one statement. And once that one statement is printed, it returns back to the top of the for loop and starts over again. So now it's asking me again, please enter a number. I'm gonna say 2 this time. And then now you see it's telling me welcome to Truth or Dare. Same for the last example. I didn't write out the code for Truth or Dare game, which is why we're only seeing that print statement. Now there was the third case. What if the user puts in the wrong number? If we click 5, it tells us you entered a invalid option, try again. So right there, that pretty much ended our code, because after this, we have no more lines of code that came out because we didn't do anything else. So this for loop ends there. This is the end of the main. So what I could do here to show you that once that loop ends, we could do a print statement that says, this is the end of the for loop tutorial. All right. Now, again, just to run it so you can see how that works, this time I'm just going to put 1, and then I'm going to put that I want to play Truth or Dare 2, and then there it is. It tells me this is Truth or Dare, and then it prints out this is the end of the for loop tutorial, because it is. So hopefully you learned something in this video. I know we covered a lot, so just to quickly recap. Up here, we did a simple for loop that is just going to print out this statement for each time the loop runs, and you could also print out the actual position that that loop is in at that current state. In this second for loop, we utilized accessing the actual letters of a string one at a time using a for loop, using char at. So that's another way you can use it. And then example 3, we created a sum and pretty much completed calculations using certain numbers, or actually the for loop in itself. And our last example was more of an interactive way to work with for loops, creating a game, allowing the user to control the game, and we also combine that with if statements to show how you can run if statements and for loops. You can also run for loop in a for loop. That's a nested for loop, but I don't want to get too deep into that because pretty much it's basically just creating a for loop inside of a for loop. So it's a little trickier to work with, but there are certain cases where that will be beneficial. So if you want to test that out, you can please do that. But I don't want to hold this too long. But what I could show you is really quickly, a for loop would look like this. So for in I equals 0, we'll put I is less than 5. We'll put I plus plus. Okay, that's our first for loop. First loop. Then we'll do another for loop, for. And when you use nested, you don't want to use the same variable in that second loop that you did for the first loop. So for this, I'm just going to show you how to set it up, and then you could test it yourself to see how it works properly. So this one, I'm going to start at 1. I'm going to do x is less than or equal to 10. Or let's do 5 too. Then I'll do I++. All right. Now that is a nested loop. So you see we have the first for loop and then we have the second for loop in it. So I'm going to put here, I'm going to put first for loop runs, and then I'll also put the loop position. So I'm going to put first loop position. It's going to be, I'm going to add I because that's the counter. All right, that's the first loop. Then this is the second loop. So let me add that, nested loop, or the second loop. And here I'm going to do the same thing. So do this. We'll put second loop runs. Let's do that. Then we do another print statement that's going to do second loop position. And then that is going to be X. All right, so there's that. I'm going to test this out one more time to close this out on a high note, learning a nested loop. So you'll just see how that works. And this is for the game. I'm going to put 1. Then I'll put that I want to run 1. All right. Boom. So now you see that this is actually running our nested for loop, and it's running for a very long time. Okay, it's creating an infinite loop. How do I know it's an infinite loop? You see that the code is running constantly. It hasn't stopped yet. So I'm going to stop it using the stop button, but it hasn't stopped. And if you scroll up, look how many times it printed, right? It does tell you second loop runs, second loop runs. We never see the first loop occur. So it occurred the first time, but then it got stuck here in this loop. Okay, so that's things you want to be careful with. That's actually why I didn't necessarily expose you guys to the nested loop, because the nested loop can get complicated. Okay, you may think, well, I can create this one this way and this one that way and it's going to work. No, I created these two randomly, and I'm just assuming they would work because if we were to create these two nested loops individually, they would work by themselves. But they don't work in the case of the nested loop. They created that infinite loop I was telling you about. You don't want to have an infinite loop, or it could potentially crash your computer. So with nested loops, they are complicated. They take more thought. You have to think all the way through the process to see how the loop would run and what's going to happen when it does. If you just create it off of assumption, you can run into an infinite loop, and that could cause you issues, right? So that infinite loop never allowed us to get to this last print statement because the loop never stopped running. So nested loops can be useful in certain cases, but not all cases. But I figured that was a cool way to end up closing it out, as nested loops are sometimes used. But overall, as you see, there's a lot to know, and there's different ways to use these for loops, right? The best way to understand how to use them and work with them is to practice, practice, practice. So you will see that for loops or loops in general in Java are very essential to many programs. So this is one of those topics that you really want to nail and understand the best you can. So that is going to wrap up this for loop tutorial. Thank you for hanging on. I know this is a pretty lengthy one, but as I said, this is one of the most important topics in Java. So I hope that it wasn't too much. Of course, for you to understand this, I would highly recommend watching this more than once. Not necessarily in the same day, but definitely watch it more than once because there might be something you catch the second time that you missed the first time. So, as always, keep practicing, keep coding. The more you practice, the better you get. The better you get, the more you increase your odds of landing that dream job of yours. Until next time, see you on the next video.